Welcome, dear audience, to today's webinar. So I'm Ilmari Kontulainen, and I'm here accompanied by Maxime Cartier. And today's topic will be about building blocks for behavior-based training. And before we get into the topic, let's go through some housekeeping items for the webinar. So the webinar recording and slides will be shared with you later today. There's the Q&A feature to ask any questions, and we can answer questions at the end. And if you have any questions after the webinar, always feel free to reach out to us at hoxhunt.com. Yeah, let's get started with the introduction. So, Maxime.
Hi, Mary, and hi, everyone. I'm Maxime. I'm the head of human risk management at Hoxhunt. I've worked for the past 9 years leading or contributing to security awareness, behavior, and culture change programs for large global companies, for example, in manufacturing, aerospace, and lastly, leading the security culture program at the retail company H&N Group. And today I use this experience to design and execute strategies to help both our internal product teams and our customers towards effective human risk management.
All right. And I'm Ilmari Kontulainen, Senior Product Manager here at Hoxhunt. And my responsibility is the end user training side. So anything related to changing the behaviors of the users. And my background is in software industry. I've been working there for like 15 years, leading some startups and doing some consultancy and all that. So the agenda for this webinar, we're talking about what is human-centered security. How do we identify and evaluate human risks? How do we design and deploy interventions? How do we measure and communicate about the impact? And then lastly, how can Hoxhunt help in all these? And the idea for this webinar stemmed from a briefing paper from Information Security Forum about human-centered security, so positively influencing security behavior. And that was like republished in 2023. It is actually an old piece from 2020, but at least like personally, when I read it, it has endured the test of time very well. And the paper starts by describing the 5 good old step maturity model, which is very similar to what they have also in Stans. Like, so from compliance to more robust metrics driven approach, and then follows up with information on how to transform security behaviors. But what struck me the most in this paper was this process that is shown on the screen that describes how to actually manage the human-centered security program. And like as most good things, the process was super simple. So 3 steps: establishing the behavioral baseline, implementing human-centered security initiatives, and then lastly, demonstrating success. And for me, as more product and process-oriented person, this made things click and it felt very intuitive. So what I wanted to actually know from you, Maxime, since you have done this in practice, does this model really match the reality? Is this how you do it?
I wish I would say. The Information Security Forum has shared quite a forward-leaning approach on security awareness for many years, and I love them for that. They're ahead of many organizations, to be honest, or they share this approach ahead of many other organizations. And the approach that they're described, it must be the basis of all security awareness work. In theory, it looks quite simple. It's close to other continuous improvement tools such as PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act. But in practice, I don't think that it's done often enough. And there are several reasons to this. There's the legacy in security awareness that stems mostly from compliance standards, frameworks, and regulations that focuses on activities such as train people annually. So every security expert has kind of an idea in their head of what security awareness is and what it should include based on these framework standards and history of what others have been doing. So for example, they know that, okay, security awareness, I need to have an onboarding training, an annual training, quarterly phishing simulations, perhaps a campaign for cybersecurity months in October. So it's easy to take this path of least resistance and start by just launching activities. Let me take an example of this. It's easy to think that let's plan for a cybersecurity day event, for example, and say, my goal is to make the greatest event and have lots of people join. But what is it that you're really trying to achieve? What is it that you're really trying to change? Is it attitudes? Is it behaviors? Is it knowledge? So to succeed, security teams must define what they're trying to achieve, even when they're working with the human element, even if it might feel soft. So that's what we define in this human risk management framework at Hoxhunt that looks a little bit like the ISF framework. So, for example, you might set as one of your program objectives to have at least 70% of people reporting phishing emails. So you measure the baseline, how many people report today. You analyze why they do it, why they do report or not report. And then only you design and deploy an intervention, you launch an activity. And after the activity has been launched, you check the results, communicate the impact, if any, and iterate.
All right. And so have you followed or like implemented this kind of model yourself successfully? And is it straightforward following these 3 steps, or is it more complex in real life?
Yeah, we've implemented it, for example, at H&M. Our team called it behavioral engineering. And our ambition there was to apply a scientific, experiment-based and data-driven mindset to everything that we were doing, basically. And so we looked at our top risks and we defined the behaviors that influence them positively or negatively. We measured those behaviors, took action, check our results. But you were asking, if it's complex or easy, and I'm not saying it was easy. I know some security folks really struggle first to get leadership support and resources to move from annual training to newer human risk management methods. And we can address that in the Q&A at the end. If that's the case of any of the webinar participants today, I'm happy to share some clues as where to go next. But even once you have this support, a lot of organizations struggle to collect the right data about security attitudes and behaviors. And once they get access to that, to make sense of this data. And this was their case too. There was a lot of preparation work, for example, to get approvals from many people and finally get our hands on the data from security tools that were used in the company. And on top of this, once we got access to the data, I hired a data analyst in my team who helped to get it out of the security tool using an API, clean it, and show it alongside other human security risk metrics in a dashboard. So it's not easy, but it's really worth it because with this method, we were able to share results with top management, such as our training makes people 6 times more likely to report phishing emails after 6 months. Or we reduce the use of this unapproved cloud platform by 80% in 3 months.
Yeah, that sounds super interesting, and we'll get more into the details later. So let's dig deeper into how it's done practice. So if we take this step by step, what kind of elements would you say the first step, identifying and evaluating the human risks, what does that entail and consist of?
Yeah, so the first, and for every organization, they must prioritize what are their top risks, right? The top security risk or the top human risk in cybersecurity. And Petri Kuvala, who's the Hoxhunt CISO advisor, and myself, we've identified 6 categories of human risk in security that you can see on the slide now. We tested these categories with dozens of our customers, but also surveyed people at security events to understand, what are the categories that are the most relevant for you. And for most people, social engineering comes first. So that's why it's first on this slide and with a higher bar. It's something that a lot of people relate with and see that phishing, smishing, all the ishing, and something that is of concern to them because they see a lot of incidents happen. Then around the same level, but far behind, you find storing and sharing information. So how to deal with data, basically, how to protect it, or to share it in a secure way. Where do you store it? Do you store it on USB devices, on our approved or unapproved cloud storages? Do you label the data? All of those kind of things. And authentication and access management, which is everything linked to passwords and MFA, for example. And even further behind are a few other categories of risk device and app configuration. So making sure that apps and devices are up to date, that potentially they're encrypted, backed up, extra safe browsing, and even further physical security, which is linked to cybersecurity in some way, or information security at least. So this is, based on our experience and also an average based on a lot of organizations that we surveyed, but it's important to adapt it for your own organization. I know that there are some organizations, for example, that consider that their crown jewels is their intellectual property. And therefore, if that's the case, they will likely prioritize risk linked to how data is stored and shared, higher than social engineering to protect their intellectual property.
Yeah. So these are very high level topics. So let's dig even deeper into this.
Yeah. So for each of these risks, what you can see now is examples of risky behaviors that increase them and security behaviors that decrease them. So you can see some examples on the slide. It's non-exhaustive because we've identified close to 100 behaviors and they just wouldn't fit there. But once again, once you have your biggest risk, define the behaviors that are important to you in your organization, the one that you want to increase or decrease. And or you can use the one defined by Hoxhunt here. And keep an eye on your emails because we will release the human risk categories and behaviors on our website. So the full list during the upcoming weeks.
Okay. And so once we have this exhaustive list of behaviors, so what kind of tools and methods have you used to establish where the risks are, what the risks are, why they happen?
So there's some basics, traditional learning and quizzes. They're useful to assess people's knowledge. Knowledge that is somehow correlated to behavior. It's a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. Then phishing simulations help you to assess some behaviors related to phishing, of course, in this simulated environment, right? But you also can integrate with your securities tool stack, whether it's, MS Defender, Zscaler, CrowdStrike, whatever you're using, to also measure behaviors in real life, what is actually happening in your organization. And for what you can't measure in real life or simulations, you can also use surveys. So basically ask people about how often do you take this behavior? It will give you an indication of how often they're doing it. And especially you can see from that if there are significant differences between different departments or different regions.
Okay. Okay. And then once you have all these insights you have collected, uh, is it enough to know that the behavior is happening or not?
That's a great question because what I've just described is, it's quantitative methods that give you information about how many people take or do not take a certain action, right? Or if they know or doesn't know about something. But what it doesn't tell you is why. Why are people doing the things they're doing? So before moving to the intervention phase that we'll discuss just next, it's helpful to dig into the data a little more and complement it with either further surveys or discussions, focus groups with people who are exhibiting a risky behavior, for example, to understand why they're doing it and how could you help them do what they already want to do, but in a secure way.
Okay. Okay. There's a lot in there. And by the way, here's shameless promotion that like Hoxhunt can actually like streamline and automate a lot of the insight collection. So the things listed in the here to determine the baseline. So testing the knowledge, testing the resilience to phishing, incorporating data even from the third-party systems, and also conducting the surveys about behaviors as well as attitudes. But getting back to the topic, so once we have all this information and we have been able to hopefully identify the biggest leverage points, so how do we move forward? We talked about the interventions just slightly. So can you tell more about the interventions that you have actually conducted to affect these risky behaviors?
Yeah, so that's the big chunk of the work, right? So many interventions are possible. Uh, but the keyword here would be targeted action, in my opinion. Once you have an idea of who is doing what and why, you can meet people where they are and help them instead of mindlessly train them. So One example is when stakeholders in a previous organization, previous role, they asked me to do something to reduce shadow IT. This wasn't actually part of our risk analysis so far and something we had spent time investigating or working on before, but they told me something like, shadow IT is a big problem. Can you do an awareness campaign about it this year? So my team looked into it and we thought that it wasn't super relevant to try to reach all employees worldwide with a communication campaign about this when you know that on average, only 10 to 20% of them are going to read your poster or watch your video, right? So instead, the team spent time to get the authorization to get access to data from our CASB, the Cloud Access Security Broker, which is a security tool that monitors the online cloud apps that people are using inside the organization. And in there, we could see how many people were actually using an approved cloud sharing services, Shadow IT. And we could see who were uploading data to these services in particular, which is where the risk lies. And it turns out that 50 people, just 50 people, it was a big organization, so that was about less than 0.05% actually of the workforce. This less than 0.05%, they were responsible for 80% of the traffic to these websites. So instead of making a big communication campaign, we reached out to these 50 people individually to understand their use case and guide them towards a secure solution. And 3 months later, 95% of them had completely stopped using the unapproved service. And the best part about this, we didn't have to bore the other 99% of people to death with a training or an information campaign that they didn't.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting and very like respectable numbers there. So as I said earlier, with Hoxhunt, we can do similar automated process that we detect certain behaviors, and then we automatically train the users about that particular behaviors and the risk associated with that. And like we have not seen as drastic results, but in a recent customer project, we were able to reduce roughly 75% of people who were downloading a large number of files from OneDrive. And how we did it was that we detected that behavior from Microsoft Defender, and we gave the users just-in-time training right after they did that behavior about risks of working the files outside of OneDrive. So I think this comes back to your point about like scaling to automation once you know the proper interventions.
Yeah, I think it's a great example. And I think what's impressive there is that you said it's fully automated, right? And getting to this result with an automation, I think it's amazing because in our case that I shared before, we reached out to people and coached them individually. So yes, we got better results, but we also spent quite a bit of time on this. And today I would try to get the best of both worlds and combine these approaches. So first have Hoxhunt delivers the automatic just-in-time nudge and training when a risky behavior is detected, which prevents, potentially 75%, you say, of people from taking this behavior again, as we've seen with some customers. And only then, for the 25% of people who are left, then I can do maybe a more manual intervention and talk to these 25% of people to find out, uh, what's happening there. So it's a huge time saving.
Yeah, yeah. But of course, like we have to admit that the tools don't fully replace human interventions, but they can help. And that has been like one of our like driving forces or motivations why we are developing behavior-based awareness training and behavior cloud with the intention to automate exactly these kind of processes. But what if we look at like interventions outside of simply educating users or bringing like just the awareness? Do you have any examples where the baseline insights or the insights you have gathered would have brought up need to do something that cannot be covered by simply educating the user about the risks or what to do or what not to do?
Yeah, let me share another example here. So once you've identified the risk, again, behavior that increase or decrease them, I think you will sometime realize that security awareness and training is not the best solution to change behaviors, as you're saying, Mary. So security practices around passwords, I think, illustrate this well, because we ask people to have strong and unique passwords, a different password for every single website that you're using or every single app, and to never share that with others. And if you ask people, they will tell you that, yes, I know. Of course, I've been trained about this. I've received this information so many times, but it's so difficult. They will tell you that it's very difficult to do that. They just can't do it, even if they know that it would be more secure. So the question becomes not how do we make people know about this, but how can we make it easy for someone to use strong and unique passwords? And the answer might be making sure that all or most of your solutions are integrated with single sign-on so that people have only one password to create or remember. Or it could be to deploy a password manager in your organization, especially for groups who tend to share accounts and passwords, then they have a way to share these accounts and passwords securely. So yeah, again, the answer is not always security awareness and training. It might be other things, tools, solutions, improving processes to help people.
Yeah, I figure it's always like a case by case decision, and you really need to understand like when the awareness is enough and when you need to change processes and tools, and you need to really understand the big picture and the system as a whole. So hey, these examples have been super interesting, and then like moving on to the third or the last step of the process. So once we have concluded our interventions, how do we measure the outcomes and who do we communicate about the results?
Yeah, question. So as you say, the last step is to check the impact we had and communicate about the results. And I see here two main audiences that we want to communicate the results to, and not the only ones, but two that I like to focus on. So the first one is local stakeholders, especially if you're a large global company. We need to share with them the security behavior data and its evolution over time. For example, through a dashboard where they can see the data for their teams only, not everyone, but their teams, and compared to the company average. So with this, the goal is to empower them to understand what is their human risk status today, where they're strong, and where they should improve. So the dashboard is the first step, but once they see that, once they have the visibility and the data, uh, it might still be difficult for them to see, okay, how can I improve there? So we also need to give tools to these stakeholders to drive the change. And that can be just, having a coaching session with them or sharing a toolbox with everyone, including like communication and training material that they can share in their own communication channels, perhaps adapt it, translate it, or whatever, but adapt it and make it their own, make it easy for them to drive the change. And the second audience is top management. We also need to share with them, of course, what is the status of the risk today and how we are working to reduce it, or we have already reduced it. They will ask for that. So it's wise to share data points that show your impact. But I would also recommend, on top of that, to create stories for each of the main risks that you've reduced. Just works better typically, especially if you're talking to a non-technical audience. So in this story, start by an example of how the risk has affected the organization or a similar organization to yours in the past. What was the baseline in terms of behaviors, what you did, and the results that you got. So for example, if you started a phishing training program, you can show examples of phishing attacks that happen in your organization, the damage they caused, if any, and the baseline of how people were reporting or clicking on them before your intervention. Then share what you've done and what the results have been after, for example, showing that your training program has increased average reporting rates by 5 or 10 times, and give another example of a threat that has been detected and reported by colleagues. This will really help you to get the sponsorship you need to continue to deep dive into these human risk management initiatives.
So here's just an example of like one way how Hoxhunt can help like measuring and communicating about the impact. So we can start by, of course, like measuring the resilience against phishing attacks by setting up a benchmark. And there you get the like full level of how many people actually report, how many don't do anything, and then of course like how many will click the link in the phishing simulation. Then naturally, you should set up your onboarding training. So there, Hoxhunt has the capabilities of training packages that allows you to like automate the onboarding training and all the reporting associated to it. We can also conduct these surveys. So by asking these questions about the behaviors, attitudes, perceptions, and whatnot. And then lastly, what I would do is to start collecting the data by integrating to Microsoft Defender or other security tools. So you can also start collecting the data about the actual behaviors conducted. Then typically it's good to start the adaptive phishing training on the same go. So you really start to tackle that most important or prevalent threat that is there. So the social engineering, and then later down the road, if you see that some of these risky behaviors are happening, you can see the actual data. Maybe you set some like automated interventions. So what we call behavior-based training, and additionally, some additional trainings on a quarterly basis based on the data that you have been collecting. And this should get you at least started from the tools perspective. So any closing words, Maxime? What are your key takeaways?
If I had to choose one, I would say, the starting point is to identify your top risks and behaviors that influence them. So, discuss what are the top risks with the rest of the security team. Discuss with the SOC, for example, since they see all of the incidents that are happening, or with the help desk. They are in touch with your colleagues every single day, so they know kind of what are the pains and what are the questions of people. So that's also a great starting point to discuss with them to find those top risks and behaviors. And then look for ways to measure those behaviors, So that's the starting point. Instead of thinking about activities right away, there are some easy that you can implement, but look also at your top risk behaviors and how to measure those.
Yeah. And I would maybe continue on that. So like only once you know how to change certain behavior, only then the automation and the intelligence are your friends. But before that, you need to do the manual work. But hey, Maxim, this has been great. Thank you so much for your time today. We'll be following up soon via email with the webinar recording and some related resources if you like to continue learning.